The important thing when we're trying to be human-centered in design is that we can think through the kind of eyes and experiences and feelings of those who we're just trying to design for. It's worth trying to figure out how you, as the innovator, as the designer, can go through the experience of your customers if it's not something you already do every day. We did some work around making airports secure and working with the TSA. And one of the first things that we tried to do was to have some of the TSA team members that we work with try and imagine what it was like for us as ordinary people to go through that experience, because they'd really been trained to think of themselves as kind of defending the airport system from terrorists. They hadn't been trained to think about how each of us experienced that process and what they might do to make that process more effective. Not always necessarily more pleasant for us, because there's a reality about security. So we had them go through the experience themselves. We had them understand what it means to be more kind of empathic. And then start to look at the places where perhaps with a slightly different design or perhaps slightly different training, you might end up with a better and more efficient experience. So starting from this point of being human-centered to design ultimately a big system that's very, very complex. It's really dangerous to assume when we're having ideas that we're going to have the best right idea right at the beginning. The first idea is going to be the right one. In fact, we really need to explore multiple ideas, and through that exploration understand sometimes how to combine those ideas together, and sometimes simply which are the strongest and the ones that ought to be taken forward. For example, in our work with HBO, we were interested in exploring how digital technology was going to change the way that they delivered content to consumers. But instead of just building kind of one version of that, we built many versions. In fact, we tried to explore what it might be like in terms of how people would use cell phones. We tried to understand what it might be like in terms of how people might use their laptops and their digital TVs and everything else. And we put all that together in a big array of kind of future products and services. In fact, what we did for them is we built out a floor of their headquarters building in New York so that senior leaders could come and executives could come and partners and play with these new products and services. It was far too complicated and too many things for HBO to develop all at once. And in fact, they ended up taking one of the ideas, which was to do with cell phones, and implementing it. But by having that array, they got a much better sense of what the future might be like, and a much better sense of which choices and which prioritizations to make. So don't make the mistake of only exploring one idea. Think about, could we explore multiple ideas around this same question? And then allow that divergent exploration to inform which are the best ideas to then converge on and take out to the marketplace. So it's really important when we're trying to innovate rapidly and we're trying to use this design approach to do so, to think about how we can iterate on our design, not necessarily try and start with a finished thing. So many, many years ago, when we were working on the first mouse with Steve Jobs, the first production mouse, the first one that consumers were going to get their hands on. We were developing it for what was called the Apple Lisa computer, and then that ultimately became the Apple Macintosh. We had seen and knew about the technology. It had been developed in a research lab, but nobody had ever figured out how to make one. So we wanted to figure out, well, what was the simplest way we could have somebody roll something around on a surface and then pick up the movement of that so we could translate it to the cursor on the screen. So that we built a prototype very, very quickly using a Ban roll-on deodorant bottle and a butter dish. We kind of glued the ball underneath the butter dish and started rolling it around and figuring out how it worked. That was nothing like the mouse, but in just a couple of hours, we had a basic prototype to understand how the mechanism might work. And then we did dozens and dozens of prototypes and iterated until we had something that we could be made by the millions. And in the end, we ended up with a much better design because we'd gone through many iterations and we'd learned about our idea as we built each one of those prototypes. So don't wait too long to build the first prototype of your idea. In fact, if you can build that first prototype in the first day, you're in pretty good shape, in my opinion. The trickiest thing about innovation is that you have to balance this idea of what people need with what you can do with technology, with what makes a sustainable business idea, or at least a sustainable idea. That can be especially difficult when we're talking about really tough constraints. So when we were working with Hewlett-Packard on microfinance in Africa. That was a really tough set of constraints, because we were trying to balance what would be useful for these microfinance banks in terms of better tracking transactions. Could we take something into the field so that they weren't just taking wads of cash and a little notebook, but actually could, just like we do in America, they could record the transaction, they could keep a good record, they could give people better choices. But we couldn't give them technology that was either too expensive or too hard to maintain. So we ended up using toy technology. We ended up building a digital device actually using technology from the toy industry, because it was super cheap and because it was super reliable and really very cheap to fix if it went wrong. So that we could better balance this idea of what was the right product, what was the right technology, and what was the right cost and kind of business model going forward. So if you're trying to innovate in your own business, don't only look at it from one direction. Remember to ask questions about, well, this might suit the needs of our users perfectly, but what are the clever ideas we can have about using technology to deliver it perhaps less expensively? Or how are we going to build a sustainable business model around this idea so that we make enough money that we can continue to offer this product or service or idea in the world? You have to keep changing your perspective as a leader and looking at the problem differently in order to make sure that you're balancing these three criteria.